Well, hello again and welcome to the fourth posting in this very informal series. And we're looking here at the relationship between science and faith. The new atheism very often asserts in a very simplistic way that science is the enemy of faith, that science gobbles up the conceptual space once occupied by God. I'm afraid it's not that simple, though of course the question is very, very interesting. I used to be a scientist myself. My first degree from Oxford is in chemistry, and I then did research in molecular biophysics. But the point I think I'd like to make is that whereas science seems to have led Richard Dawkins away from God, it led me towards God. And one of the points I'd like to emphasize here very, very clearly is that the scientific method is actually neutral. It doesn't lead you to God or away from God. It can do either. Science is neutral on these matters. Science does not compel you to atheism. It does not compel you to religious belief, but it can be made to be consistent with both of these positions. I think that is a very important point because the cultural authority of science actually depends on its standing above these kind of debates. And one of the issues that was raised by Thomas Huxley, Darwin's great advocate in the 19th century, is that if science gets hijacked by religious or anti-religious fundamentalists, then it's in a very bad place. Huxley wrote these words, which I think are very, very significant here. Science commits suicide when it adopts a creed. I think that's exactly right. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many scientists are angry at the new atheism for using science as a weapon against religion, in effect distorting and devaluing science and making it simply into a weapon in their own battle against something that they clearly believe to be wrong, but most scientists see as peripheral to the main agenda of science itself. Science simply cannot comment on many issues. Let's take a very simple question. How do we know that the chemical formula for water is H2O? Well, the answer is simple. That's what the scientific evidence tells us. And I don't think anybody would quibble with that. And I think Richard Dawkins is entirely right when he praises a science for their ability to give clear, reliable answers to important questions like that. And they do. But what about other questions? What about, for example, the meaning of life? That's clearly an important question, but it's one that science doesn't really answer. And in fact, I would go further than that and say if science does answer that, it is not speaking as science, but speaking as some metaphysical or religious dogmatism. The key point here was made by Peter Medawar many years ago. Peter Medawar won a Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work on immunobiology, and his work was really regarded as outstanding in his day and age. He wrote a book called The Limits of Science, in which he reflects on what science can do and what it can't do. And science is great, he says. It's very, very good at clarifying the structures, the ordering of the natural order. And in theory, there are no limits to what science can do in these domains. But then, Medawar says, there are other questions which science cannot answer now and which no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. And here are examples of the questions he gives in this category. What are we all here for? What is the point of living? And Medawar simply says these are good, important questions. They are questions that we really need to take with great seriousness, but they are not questions that science is going to be able to answer. Now, that's not a problem for anybody. If science can't answer the meaning of life, we look for answers somewhere else. But in a new atheism, there is this belief, as far as I can see, that somehow science answers these questions, and if it doesn't answer them, there are no questions that may be answered in this way. And that seems to me to be puzzling. One of the points I make in my book, Why God Won't Go Away, is that science is very, very good at answering many questions, but there are many that it doesn't. This doesn't mean that science is bad or anything like that. It simply means that there are limits to it. And when you use any tool, you need to calibrate it and work out what those limits are. And the God question simply lies outside the scope of the scientific method. Now, of course, many new atheists will say, well, science says there is no God. Well, we need to ask a question here. And the question is this: are they speaking as scientists or as atheists? I'd like to suggest it's the latter. They are harnessing science for their own agendas, and that isn't where the sciences on their own take us. The sciences, I think, have much to say, much that's good. There's nothing wrong with them, but there are people who try to use the sciences for their own agendas, and we see this in the new atheism. My fear is that science will be devalued by simply being used as a cudgel with which to beat religion. For me, science opens up a great view of reality which is supplemented, not contradicted, by my faith in God. They go together, and I explore this in more detail in a book I wrote recently dealing with these themes called Surprised by Meaning: Science, Faith, and How We Make Sense of Things. But we need to move on now and look at another key theme in the new atheist response to religious belief, namely that in some way religion intrinsically leads to violence. We'll look at this in the next posting.